A student vanished mysteriously from her own home in the middle of the night, leaving behind no trace. Police launched a search almost immediately, and before long, a chilling reality began to take shape. Piece by piece, investigators uncovered the truth, one that would shock the entire nation. Eve Carson was born on November 19, 1985, in Athens, Georgia. From a young age, she stood out as exceptionally determined and focused. In high school, she served as vice president of the student council, volunteered at both a nursing home and a shelter for abused teens, worked as a congressional page, and assisted in a stem cell research lab, all while still managing her studies. After graduating with honors, Eve enrolled at the University of North Carolina, pursuing a double major in political science and biology. Her stellar academic record earned her a highly competitive scholarship. On campus, she quickly emerged as a leader, taking on key roles in numerous student organizations. But Eve's impact extended beyond the university. She continued her community work, taught science at a local elementary school, and even dedicated time to volunteer projects abroad. She spent a summer in Ecuador assisting doctors, studied for a semester in Cuba, and joined a research team in Egypt. Clearly, she was among the most accomplished students at UNCC. Eve had big ambitions for her future, and she was already on the path to achieving them. Even before graduation, she had secured a job offer from a major company, ready to launch her career after earning her degree. By February, Eve was 22 years old and in her final year of college. She was living off campus with a tight-knit group of friends. On the night of March 5th, around 1:30 a.m., her roommates headed out to a party. They invited Eve to come along, but she declined, opting to stay in and prepare for her upcoming classes. They left without her, not returning until around 4:30 that morning. When her friends returned home, they instantly felt that something wasn't right. The front door was wide open, the lights were still on, but Eve was gone. So was her car. None of it made sense. Why would she leave in the middle of the night? And why leave the house unlocked like that? They tried calling her, but she never answered. Still, they clung to the hope that something unexpected had come up, and she'd simply had to step out. They waited, expecting her to walk back through the door. But by the next day, there was still no sign of Eve. That's when one of her friends finally decided it was time to call the police. Once investigators heard the details, they revealed something chilling. Earlier that same morning, police had discovered the body of a young woman, though her identity was still unknown. They showed a photo to one of Eve's friends, and in an instant she recognized it. It was Eve, just a few hours after she was last seen, around 5 a.m. Police had received a call from a woman who lived about a mile from Eve's house. She had been jolted awake by the sound of gunfire, followed by a scream. Alarmed, she immediately dialed the authorities. When officers arrived, they discovered the body of a young woman lying on the ground. She had no ID, no phone, nothing to identify her, only the grim evidence that she had been shot multiple times. Once her friend confirmed it was Eve, detectives interviewed her roommates and pieced together a rough timeline. At 1:30 a.m., she was still at home studying. By 5 a.m., her body was found a mile away. The urgent questions became, how did she get there and who was responsible? Since her car was missing, investigators suspected robbery. That theory seemed even more likely when a search of her room revealed her wallet and credit cards were gone too, and they weren't found anywhere near her body. The medical examiner later confirmed there were no signs of sexual assault, ruling that out as a possible motive. When investigators checked Eve's phone records, they saw the last signal had pinged from a tower near a highway just outside town, but the phone itself was never found. It appeared the killer had tossed it away somewhere in the woods. Then came the first significant lead. A car matching the description of Eve's was discovered abandoned just a few miles from her home. Authorities immediately had it sent to forensics for fingerprint and DNA analysis. Meanwhile, detectives uncovered another key piece of evidence. Forensic experts examined Eve's computer, the one she used for her studies, and found it had been active until around 3:30 a.m. This meant she was still at home for at least 2 hours after her friends had left for the party. Only later did she somehow end up a mile away where her body was discovered. By this time, word of Eve's murder had spread across the city, sending shockwaves through her college campus. Nearly everyone knew her. She had been a leader in countless student organizations, and her sudden loss was devastating. Alongside the grief came a mounting sense of unease. Students and residents alike feared for their safety, and the lack of concrete leads from police only heightened the anxiety. Tips poured in. Students reported anything that seemed even slightly suspicious, hoping to help push the case forward. But despite the flood of information, none of it brought investigators any closer to finding answers. Then came a crucial breakthrough. Since Eve's credit cards were missing, detectives pulled her transaction records, and what they found was alarming. Just 18 minutes after Eve last used her computer, someone had withdrawn $700 from her account in 2 separate transactions. Attempts to take out more money failed due to the daily limit. The ATM used for the withdrawals was located near a shopping center on the far side of town. Detectives quickly requested the security footage, and as they hoped, it provided a valuable lead. The video showed a man sitting inside Eve's car using her card at the ATM. In the back seat, there seemed to be another figure. Investigators suspected it could have been Eve herself, but the image quality was too poor to confirm. Forensic experts tried to enhance the footage for clarity, but their efforts failed. Meanwhile, police learned that the suspect had attempted to use Eve's card at several other ATMs across the city. Unfortunately, none of those machines were equipped with cameras. This pattern continued until March 7th, when investigators received another alert about an attempted withdrawal. At around 12:30 a.m., the suspect tried to use an ATM inside a 24-hour convenience store. The transaction was declined, but officers rushed to the scene in a neighboring town. Unlike the earlier locations, this store did have a working security camera. Reviewing the footage, investigators spotted someone using Eve's card, but in a shocking twist, it wasn't the same man seen in the first ATM video. Now, detectives faced 2 possibilities. Either more than one person was involved in Eve's murder, or the killer had passed her card to an accomplice. They attempted to identify the second suspect, but again, the footage was too grainy to make a positive match. With the trail growing cold, police turned to the public for help. They released both sets of surveillance images to the media, hoping someone would recognize the individuals. Given how much attention the case had already drawn, the police station was quickly overwhelmed with tips. Yet, despite the flood of calls, none of the leads brought investigators closer to finding Eve's killer. Everything changed. On March 12th, an anonymous caller came forward with a critical tip, claiming to recognize the man in the second convenience store video. His name, the caller said, was Dario Atwater. Detectives began digging into Atwater's background, and what they found was alarming. At just 21 years old, he already had a long criminal record with multiple arrests for robbery, assault, drug offenses, and other crimes. Though he had served time behind bars, he had also been released early on several occasions. Even more unsettling, they discovered that just 2 days after Eve's murder, Dario was scheduled to appear in court for carrying a handgun while on probation. Investigators pulled his old mugshots and compared them to the convenience store surveillance footage. The resemblance was undeniable. They were confident they had their man. adding to their case, they learned that DeRio lived only a short distance from the store. Detectives wasted no time heading to his residence. During questioning, DeRio denied any involvement in Eve's death, but the video evidence gave police enough reason to take him into custody. As the case developed, detectives uncovered another connection. DeRio had been in frequent contact with a 17-year-old named Lawrence Levet, who, despite his young age, already carried a criminal record of his own. When investigators reviewed Lawrence's mugshot, they immediately recognized him as the person driving Eve's car in the first ATM footage. Unlike DeRio, however, Lawrence did not surrender easily. He barricaded himself inside his home, forcing law enforcement to call in a SWAT team. Once he was finally apprehended, he too denied any involvement. Both suspects were charged and placed in custody, awaiting trial. With neither man cooperating, investigators turned to building their case through other methods. Cell phone data soon revealed something critical. On the night of Eve's murder, both suspects' phones had pinged off a tower near her neighborhood, even though they lived in a different city. Detectives concluded that DeRio and Lawrence had likely chosen Eve at random, looking for someone to rob and spotting that she was home alone late at night. Based on the ATM withdrawals, investigators concluded that Eve had been forced to drive her captors to multiple locations where she was made to hand over her bank card.
After reaching the $700 daily withdrawal limit, they drove her to a wooded area on the edge of town, where they ultimately murdered her. Because of the brutality of the crime, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty for Denario. Lawrence's case, however, was more complicated. Since he was still a minor, the maximum sentence he could face was life in prison. Prosecutors knew the evidence alone might not guarantee a conviction, so they made a calculated move, offering Denario a deal. If he pled guilty, they would take the death penalty off the table. He agreed, and in doing so, confessed to the chilling details of that night. According to Denario, he and Lawrence had set out with the simple plan of committing a robbery to make some fast cash. Lawrence had called him with the idea of targeting someone on the university campus. As they drove through a neighborhood, they spotted Eve through a window in her home and decided she would be their victim. Armed with guns, they broke in, forced her into her own car, and began driving from ATM to ATM, attempting to drain her account. Throughout the terrifying ordeal, Eve begged them to let her go. She promised she wouldn't say anything. She only wanted to return home, but the two had already made up their minds. Denario admitted they decided to kill her because she had seen their faces. Even though they hadn't bothered to disguise themselves, eventually they brought her to a deserted street and shot her multiple times with 2 different weapons. He also revealed something especially heartbreaking. Just moments before they killed her, Eve asked them to pray with her. Instead of showing her any compassion, they executed her without hesitation. In April 2010, 2 years after the crime, DeRio was found guilty. Because of his plea deal, he was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 30 years, spared from the death penalty he had once faced. After the verdict, DeRio turned to Eve's parents, apologized for what he had done, and admitted he deserved the punishment he received. Meanwhile, Lawrence refused to plead guilty, and his trial began in December 2011. Despite his attorney's efforts to argue his innocence, DeRio's confession, combined with the overwhelming evidence, led to Lawrence being found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But his story didn't end there. In 2013, the State Court of Appeals overturned his sentence, citing a separate ruling that determined life without parole for juvenile offenders was excessively harsh and unconstitutional. As a result, Lawrence was granted a new trial. This time, he was more vocal, telling the court that everyone makes mistakes and insisting he wasn't the monster people believed him to be.
Yet his words carried little sincerity, and he showed no genuine remorse. Ultimately, the judge once again sentenced him to life in prison. It's also worth noting that Lawrence had been considered a suspect in another eerily similar case. In January 2008, just months before Eve's murder, a 29-year-old student was killed during a home invasion. Following that crime, money was withdrawn from the victim's account at several ATMs across the city. However, investigators were never able to gather enough evidence to directly tie Lawrence to the murder, and the charges were eventually dropped. Eve's case not only drew national attention, but also sparked meaningful change. In February, North Carolina lawmakers passed new legislation imposing tougher penalties and stricter procedures for anyone involved in gang-related crimes. The law officially took effect on December 1st and applies to all offenses committed from that date forward. It was legislation born directly from the tragedy that claimed Eve's life. At her university, a scholarship was created in her name, and a memorial garden was established on campus to honor her memory. In February 2009, one of Eve's close friends became a finalist on American Idol. During his time on stage, he shared that Eve's death had inspired him to take a chance and audition. He said that without her influence, he never would have found the courage or determination to chase his dream. If you found this case compelling, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We share new true crime stories every night. Until next time, stay sharp, stay vigilant.